Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers. As you can see, I am by myself this time, so gleeful, cats away. The question that we have this time is from a patron, Kristoffer, who has asked, how did ancient leaders address their troops when they were making speeches? And makes the point that in movies they are often riding back and forth in front of the first line and are therefore only a few troops would hear the speech, or they'd only hear bits of it, a little bit like Life of Brian. When did they do it? Just before the actual battle, before leaving camp or lining up in battle formation? And the answers to all of those are, I won't say we don't know, but the reality of it is that when you have these speeches, and we have speeches in the middle of battle, we have speeches before battle, often it's a historian's trope where each side gets a massive speech, and there is no way that that historian heard those speeches and remembered them word for word, or wrote them down, certainly from the other side. And so we occasionally get historians telling us that the speeches that they record or put into the mouths of their characters are the tenor of what could have been said, or maybe even that was said that they've heard from various different types. So on the one hand, you have this idea that they're a literary trope, that you put speeches into the mouths of characters as appropriate things that they may have said during or before a battle. But on the other hand, we have sort of speeches throughout this entire period and going into the medieval period, and even down to the current day, where speeches are given before battle, during battle, one word, nuts, So these sorts of things do still occur in battle, and there's an entire genre of literature that grows up around the pithy statement in ancient warfare, the apothegmata, the appropriate thing to say at the right time. And probably the best example of that is, we'll fight in the shade, when they're told that their arrows blot out the sun. So these things are said. The other thing about how were they heard, indeed, riding across the front lines of your troops probably isn't how those speeches were made. But one of the other things that's interesting is that if you're standing in a pre-industrial field and you are declaiming to a group of men listening to you, your voice will travel much, much further than you think it will, especially if you're in a if you're on the downhill slope, and so therefore you're making a kind of an amphitheater with the troops around you, you will actually get heard a long, long way away. And so it's possible that these speeches were given pre-battle, and that the voice is carried. At the beginning of Book 11 of the Iliad, you have the idea that strife is in the middle of the Achaean ships and shouts, and that the whole point of where she stood is that her shout could be heard at one end of the fleet to the other. So on one end you have Odysseus's ships, and on the other end you have Achilles and the Myrmidons. So, the shout carries. And we have, characters in the Iliad who are the master of the war cry. So yes, there are louder people than others, and so there are some who are given to be able to be heard further than others. Some modern ideas are that there would be someone who would relay the speech. We don't have any evidence of that, and it would be very sort of odd to then wait until the relay had happened and then the murmur had occurred, and then start the next sentence. We don't get evidence of that so much. And, as a very rare example of me attempting some experimental archaeology, I did take my then fiancée, now my wife, to a medieval battlefield. So it was the Battle of Maldon, so Maldon in Essex in the United Kingdom. And there, of course, is an Old English poem about that battle, which indeed has these speeches before the battle, done across a tidal causeway. So I dragged my wife there, rolling her eyes at me as I was gleefully leaping up and down about being on such a medieval battlefield. And I crossed the causeway and asked my fiancée to stay on the far side, and then, being a geek, I went to the other side of this causeway and I recited the speeches. Now, it was at low tide, so I went all the way to the island, probably 200 meters away, very still day. I didn't even have to raise my voice to be heard by her. And so the actual amount of distance that my voices could carry was remarkable, and I was amazed how easily that would be done. And in the poem, the speeches occurred over the water, so that was quite sort of revelatory to me, that you could actually make a speech, and if you are declaiming the way that they do declaim in the movies, that the speech is given in such a dramatically loud fashion with these pithy encapsulations of the idea, give me liberty or give me death, all those sorts of things. I'm suddenly having visions of Blackadder. That those sorts of comments could be delivered to an army at very effective volume to a great number of troops at the same time. Now, we do have evidence of war cries in lots of ancient battles, and essentially competitive war crying, where, for instance, in the late Roman conflicts between the Goths and the Romans, you have the Goths issuing their war cry, and then in reply the Romans issue their Berytus, the Roman war cry that we get some evidence on in Vegetius and Maurice's Strategicon. And so there's this idea that you would start low and then raise the pitch and the volume at the same time until it became sort of deafening. One wonders whether those were done as a way of drowning out speeches. If you saw the enemy general standing in front of his army, clearly speaking to them, start up a fierce war cry so that, they would be drowned out. That's possible. It's also sort of one of those phase of battle things that's a problem, that there seems to be phases of battle, that battles begin by some bizarre mutual agreement that we've talked about. Then there seems to be often a parley before the battle between the generals in the middle of the battlefield, and then back we go to talk to our troops and then fight the battle. And obviously in the literature it's done he said, then he said, but probably those speeches could have happened at exactly the same time on opposite sides of a battlefield. And it's an interesting one about then the battle was raised and the troops were G'd up. I'm just been doing some research on Attila the Hun, and according to Jordanes, whose account of the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, or Chalon, however you want to call it, is the best one we've got. Once the Huns have attacked and been repulsed by Aetius and Thorimund, the Visigoth, then Attila gives a big speech. A big speech, like Attila the Hun gives an enormous speech. And you're like, well, that seems unlikely in the middle of the battle, but we can't dismiss it out of hand. And one of the reasons for that is that the criticisms of Roman warfare that Attila makes are not the kind of thing that you would expect a Roman historian, a sympathetic Roman historian, to say. That, he calls the Romans standing with their shields a weak attack, and that the Huns are able to defeat the Romans not even by the dust of battle or the war cry, but even just by their approach, they can make the Romans run. And so that G's the Huns up, and off they go and they attack and get repulsed again. But the interesting thing about that sort of idea is that you can't dismiss it completely. You can say this is a literary trope, but there's content in there that's like someone may have said something along the lines of what we're being told. We have the evidence in Epaminondas in the middle of the Battle of Leuctra is given one of these pithy sayings, these apothegms, and he says, give me one more step, which relates to the idea of the athismos and pushing one more step. I know that that's another controversy, the athismos and what it represented, but that idea of one more step and we'll win is the kind of laconic breathless thing that you might get out. Again, there's the idea of the pithy statement after the battle. At the Battle of Mantinea, Epaminondas is taken off the battlefield, wounded, mortally wounded, and he learns of the victory, and the men around him lament that he didn't have any children, and he says, but I have two daughters. They are Leuctra and Mantinea. So, that kind of, that's brilliant. One wonders whether in your death throes you would remember to be pithy and have the encapsulation. Oh, brilliant. Oh, he's dead. Sorry. That I'm being flippant, but that kind of tradition has grown up around some generals. And I think you can never dismiss it out of hand and say that didn't happen, because it could have happened, and it still does happen, and it still continues to happen. And at the same time, some of these speeches by very eloquent generals that are designed to motivate their men could well have happened before a battle, and if they've been trained as a rhetor, as most of these ancient generals were, their voice could have carried a big distance in a pre-industrialized world, on a hillside or on a plain. So I think that's generally how it would happen, that you would be trained to talk and declaim and be heard, and you would go onto the battlefield and you would show your troops that that's what you could do. So I think you can't dismiss that the ancient generals did address their troops in the way that we're sort of used to. What they said and how long they spoke for, and whether the historians' accounts of them are accurate is another sort of statement, but I think they certainly said things and more often than not, probably what our historians record may have been close to what was actually said.